Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. In the year 79, Mount Vesuvius began to erupt. According to the ancient author Pliny, it happened around midday, and for hours, hot volcanic ash spewed into the air, smothering and encasing the ancient Roman city of Pompeii. It has been almost 300 years since excavations there began, but archaeologists continue to reveal what has been frozen in time. Last week, the newest revelations were of children's drawings on walls and vases. Gabriel Zuchtregel is the director of the Pompeii Archaeological Park. He is in Pompeii. Gabriel, hello.
Hello.
Tell us about these findings of children's drawings. What was uncovered?
Well, I think it's one of these aspects of the site of Pompeii which are so unique and really help us understand a different side of the Roman world, which we know thanks to many texts and great monuments. Think of Rome and the Forum and the Colosseum and so forth. But in Pompeii, we see a different ancient Roman world. We see the daily life. We see the very rich households with huge gardens and paintings and sculptures. But we see also the majority of people who lived in rather poor conditions. And we see, for example, children drawing on walls in a garden, house, courtyard, where they evidently were playing, and we can guess at the age of these children between 5, 6, maybe 7 years old. They draw very simple human figures, just the head and the legs and arms coming right out of the head, which still today is a way in which small children depict, paint, draw the human figure.
Can you describe the drawings? They're charcoal drawings, right?
They took, evidently, there are kitchens around this courtyard, more than one. So probably this was some kind of residence or hotel or, inn where people could stay and rent a room. And this was kind of the service area. And they took from the kitchen a piece of charcoal and drew gladiators on the walls and also animal hunts. And the psychologists with whom we are collaborating from the University of Naples, Federico II, told us that probably they actually saw these scenes, which then they were drawing on the walls to show them to other children. Look what I've been seeing. And where could they see something like that? In the amphitheater. So there were these very brutal, bloody games, gladiators, one fighting against the other, animal hunts, maybe boars, wild animals. And evidently children at a very small age had access to these events, which we can guess also from other sources. And then we see the impact this had on these small children. And we can also compare it to another extraordinary finding from this excavation, because right next to the gladiators, there was a small hand, as sometimes we still do today. A child had drawn a line around his small hand, and this too gives us approximately the age, and it's the same, 5, 6 years old.
It's incredible to think that they saw the gladiators.
Well, especially in a time like ours where we discuss a lot about violence in computer games and television and cinema, and what it means for young people to be exposed to this. And there are actually studies on how this influences the way young people develop into early adulthood. And we can see that actually in the Roman epoch, it was even more brutal, because the blood you were seeing was real, and the shouting and the smells and everything. So the amphitheater really was the great passion of the time. We have descriptions of people being almost like addicted to seeing these games.
I want to talk about some of the other things that your team and you have discovered, but just on the children and their drawings, what do you take from that? What have you learned in seeing these drawings?
Well, I think one is the Roman world was in great disorder. We tend to think, if we look at excavations where you don't have the furniture and the drawings, and you only have the foundation walls of a building, and then you try to imagine how it looked like, and we tend to think in a very orderly way, right? There was everything at its place, and people had not so much stuff in ancient times. This is if you look at movies, so you see maybe a torch. They actually didn't use torches a lot, but rather small oil lamps. And you see rooms which are basically almost empty. Actually, what we see in Pompeii, cramped spaces. Everything was a bit improvised, and rebuilding, restructuring houses all the time. Nothing really in its proper place, and so we see a more chaotic picture of the ancient world. And in the midst of this, children playing around. Probably their parents didn't have so much time to look after them. They certainly didn't have the money to pay for an educator and a teacher, as rich households could do and often did. But they just were playing and drawing on the walls, and maybe afterwards getting shouted at, or worse, because this was not what they were supposed to do. And so I think this helps us a lot to get a better idea of the daily life in the ancient world. And from that, then we can draw some conclusions and say, well, what does it mean if in the amphitheater, crucifixion, for example, was something that could be part of the spectacle of the games. In the breaks, sometimes, between the morning animal hunts and the afternoon gladiator games, you could see crucifixions of criminals and rebellious slaves. And there's actually an inscription from Pompeii advertising this kind of event in another town in Campania, in southern Italy, in Cuma. And you have to imagine this being publicly exposed also to small children, what this means for the whole society and culture. And then you have to imagine these people learning about someone in the Eastern Mediterranean being crucified and becoming a religious leader and founder of a new religion, Jesus of Nazareth. So it makes you understand really how strange and how new, for example, Christianity was at the time, and how unconceivable for many people that such a cruel way of punishment, which was normally reserved to slaves and non-citizens, could become then a religious symbol, actually, the cross.
You also found, and you mentioned cruelty and enslavement, you found some frescoes, but also a large wood-burning oven, the sense that there was perhaps a bakery. And in and around that bakery were signs of poverty and enslavement. What did you find there?
Well, what we found was actually almost like the borderline between living, in a beautifully painted house and with large rooms and the almost like hell on earth, right? Slavery, harsh, very hard work, which slaves were doing in the mills, because the bakeries were always combined with mills and donkeys together. They had to turn around the mills the whole day long, and in this way they would turn grain into flour and then bake bread. Many people basically were eating bread in the ancient world. The poor often didn't have a kitchen in their home, so they just were eating bread and maybe some onion or vegetables or fruits, whatever the season offered. So our daily bread, so to speak.
Yeah.
And what's astonishing here is that this is part inside the house. You have a wall, it's painted on one side, and on the other, there's this very different context with slaves and donkeys and hard work. And it's part of the same house, but it's separated. And there's even iron bars separating a window from this bakery part to the rest of the house inside the same house. So you really get the idea of people being kept there in slavery, in bonds, and working as enslaved workers.
You have said people knew there was slavery. About a third of the population of the ancient world was enslaved, but chose rather to focus on the great philosophical, scientific, and political achievements of the era. Why is it important for you to reveal not just the lives of the wealthy who lived in that area, but also the true extent of what life was like in Pompeii?
Well, we always have to remember that archaeology as a modern discipline started more or less in the same time when Pompeii was excavated, as really not only scientific endeavor, but as a kind of philosophical, political, and moral project. People were living at the time in Europe very much under the influence of the church and the moral of the church and what you could do and what you couldn't do. Homosexuality in the 18th century was still under punishment of death, at least theoretically. They didn't have democracy, so they had, counts and kings and queens deciding everything, basically. And so they saw Pompeii with all these sensual and erotic paintings and nude bodies. So it seemed like a dream, like a better world where finally people could live more freely and with a less conditioned relationship with their sexuality, seemingly, and their body. And they voted every year, so they had a public, a local administration. They had the emperor in Rome, but they kind of dealt with their own stuff locally. And so it seemed like a great vision also for the future. Today, obviously, this has completely changed. We have seen also the flaws and the limitations of ancient democracy, for example, which was only for men. So women were completely excluded. And so in a way, we move beyond this, very much beyond this vision. And we can start to see what they at the time didn't want to overemphasize or to marginalize, because it didn't fit into this political program of taking antiquity and making out of that a new political vision. And so they knew there was slavery. You couldn't deny it, but they said, well, it was a human kind of slavery. And actually people could gain their freedom, which is true, but it was obviously only a small percentage of enslaved people who eventually could become free. And they still were somehow stigmatized and marginalized. So what we have to do today is to look at this and say, what can we still learn something from antiquity? And I think it's not anymore, the fact that we want to get back to this model. Absolutely not. But what we can learn is the vast variety, the also capacity of humans to adapt to very different situations. And I think in our own time, this is also a positive message. We have to deal with many crises, like the climate crisis and other issues. And so I think archaeology today is really about sustainability and the longue durée, so the human development in a long perspective, which helps us to see how people dealt with crisis and catastrophes in the past. And so I think it's a message at the end of hope. We can, if we want, we can change, and we have changed a lot in the past.
Are you surprised? Perhaps not, because you're there doing that work, but that as I said, 1900 years since Pompeii was buried, that we're still learning things, that we're still not just finding things, but that we're still learning things from what was there.
I think it depends a lot on technical development in the excavation techniques, but also in the possibilities to make scientific analysis. For example, if you think of skeletons of victims of the eruption, now today we can analyze age, sex, illnesses they might have had. And we can even analyze the DNA and see if they were maybe relatives or children of different families and so forth. This is one thing. The other is that the questions we are asking change over time. So in the 18th century, people were mainly interested, in the beautiful things, painting, sculpture, public buildings, the houses of the wealthy. Archaeology has changed a lot, and today we are simply asking different questions, and this means we're getting different answers. And so I think there will always be a new way to look at antiquity, simply because we ourselves look from a different viewpoint. And so it's not surprising at all that we still can learn a lot from Pompeii.
It's very humbling in some ways.
Absolutely. And I think this is also why we should definitely never excavate too much and leave something to the future generations who might and probably will have even more in-depth methodologies and certainly different questions. So it's always a process, and we are only a small piece in this long story.
What a pleasure to talk to you. Gabriel Zuchtriegel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gabriel Zuchtriegel is the director of the Pompeii Archaeological Park. There is an exhibition on now in Pompeii through the 15th of December. It's called The Other Pompeii, and it shows what everyday life was like for the less affluent and poorer people in that city.